Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third webinar of the series AI Talks at ETUI. My name is Aida Ponce del Castillo, and today I will be your host. And today we have a special guest, Professor Frank Pasquale, a leading expert on the law of artificial intelligence, algorithms, and machine learning. Frank is a professor of law at Brooklyn Law School, and I know many of you know him, but I will give you a little bit of his bio. And he's also affiliate fellow at Yale University Information Society Project and a member of the American Law Institute. He has previously worked at the Piper and Maybury Professor of Law at the University of Maryland. And recently, he has been appointed to the US National AI Advisory Committee. His book that I have here, The Black Box Society, The Secrets of Algorithms That Control Money and Information, is an absolutely must for anyone interested on AI and law, or anyone interested on AI. And it's fascinating, and it has been internationally recognized as a landmark study on law and political economy of information asymmetries. He has other publications, of course, and other books, but I want to point out this one, which he has edited, and it's brand new, and I'm very happy to having it. It's the Oxford Handbook of Ethics of AI, with absolutely amazing material. So, Frank Pasquale, thank you very much for being here. I'm pretty sure that all of the audience is very excited of having you. And please, you have the floor.
Well, thank you so much, Aida. And this is really terrific to be here. And I will just share a few slides to begin with. I'm going to try to go through these relatively quickly so we can get to a discussion and then for a very packed agenda for today. So let me just start from scratch, and it's a real honor to be presenting for the European Trade Union Institute. I really admire the advocacy on behalf of workers, and I think it's going to be incredibly important as AI becomes more and more prominent in the workplace. And what I want to focus today is, how is AI being used to judge people? How is it being used to judge applicants for jobs, to judge people when they're in jobs, and even to judge their bosses and the management of corporations? And in thinking about AI, right now, I think a lot of it is an extension of what I'd call metric power. It's the effort to use metrics to both evaluate and often to control individuals, to understand, to give them a reputation. And there's a slew of books on metric power, including the eponymously named Metric Power by David Beer, which is a more theoretical take. To move from the left, Jerry Muller points out that these metrics can be tyrannical, that if we are too obsessed with, say, wringing out every last hour or a bit of effort or profit from the worker, that this can be a form of tyranny. And he looks at that sort of tyranny from many perspectives. However, there are other scholars, such as the legal scholar Benedict Kingsbury, anthropologist Sally Larry, and legal scholar and Kevin Davis, to talk about the power of these indicators to improve things. So if we could, say, turn around the metrics and try to say that we're going to, rather than have them only be used to evaluate workers, to have them evaluate workplaces and bosses as well, that would be positive. But they are still, as Sauder and Espelin call them, engines of anxiety. They cause a lot of anxiety among workers. And that's why I try to identify them as part of the forces of production described by David F. Noble. Just as we see the history of automation fundamentally changed the workplace for many individuals, so too is the ability for bosses to continually surveil and to watch workers, to have bots, to have keystroke loggers, to have video cameras on. All of these things, I think, are going to be just as important in the transformation of the forces of production as earlier versions of the assembly line, the foreman, the boss that were described by historians of capitalism like David Noble. As this sort of power of AI expands, here are some examples of just how intimate it has become. So if you think about this, and I call all of these examples the digitization of judgment. And I use that kind of strange phrase because it's a lot of times we think about the role of a worker or in various places is to judge a situation and to judge what should be done in the situation. And the digitization of judgment means that the AI in each of these examples is undermining the ability of the worker to decide or supplementing it. And this question of undermining or supplementing is really important and is being used to judge the workers involved. So for example, a traditional gatekeeper like a teacher may decide grades in part based on which students are paying attention. But there was recently released in China a system called Class Care that would record all expressions on the students' faces every second. It's either second or a minute. One system took pictures every second, one took pictures every minute of the students' faces, and from that would assign a score based on a database of attentiveness, and that would ultimately score the teacher as well. So the students are being controlled in a way by the AI that can match their facial expression to a database of facial expression showing either attentiveness or boredom or distractedness, et cetera. And that was in turn being used to judge the teacher. Also, in terms of just before people even get jobs, our second example is, human resources department can review resumes and then interview candidates. But an algorithmic resume sorter will often find qualified candidates now. And AI can review video interviews for likely fit. There are many companies that will look at someone's video interview. They'll send in a recording and they can analyze it. And one of the scariest things to me is that the exact form of analysis is often unknown because it's claimed to be a proprietary trade secret, right? So that's a real problem if we don't even know how we're being judged. But there are also, we have a broad idea. One form of judgment could be of the person's expressions. Another could be of a natural language processing of the transcript. And the idea becomes, what is the benchmark, right? What is the ideal worker that they're trying to find? This again, though, is often secretive. And so we don't know. But the worry a lot of people express is that firms could just be trying to play the past into the future. Whoever happened to be a good worker in whatever their modes of expression, of speaking, et cetera, that was what we're trying to find with this video hiring agent. Similarly, there are examples, say, for a suicide prevention hotline, where algorithms now are playing this role. A police chief may assign officers to neighborhoods based on recent criminal activity, whereas now a predictive policing algorithm can combine that data with information on weather, recent economic trends, et cetera. And even when it comes to judgments like a doctor's judgment about when to terminate treatment of someone who has been in a persistent vegetative state at the end of life, that can also be supplemented, certainly now not replaced, but supplemented by an algorithm that will be determining the likelihood of that person living, say, beyond a month or beyond a week or whatever it might be. Now, these types of examples, I think, are all really important. And there's even more, and it's not only a matter of medicine, policing, healthcare, et cetera. There are examples of professional judgment being supplanted, like, for example, attorneys, what they decide, and editors, what they decide. And each of these, I think, is a place where AI is entering the workforce, and the question becomes, how does that get regulated, right? Do we allow, for example, an algorithm to replace editors as managers of writers? Or do we insist on, say, some human supervision? Do we say it has to be refined? Or do we try to limit its scope or limit the data that goes into it? That's how I would frame the question in many of these areas. I'd also just note that, there's so much data out there, right? Just to give an example, this is a chart of how people rate each other in the healthcare system. So you can see, for example, if you go down from the raters of patients of doctors, there are now patients who are reviewing their doctors, right? Either on Angie's List, Yelp, consumer reviews, Google, et cetera. Some of these are really strange. Like, for example, there are patients that rank the doctors or rate them or comment on them based only on if there's free parking if they can park at the doctor's office or something like that. And these situations of ranking and rating create what I call a lot of cheap but often junky data. Okay, and as we see these different entities ranking and rating each other and creating data about each other, that's yet another example of something getting out of control, right? That there's a certain out of controlness of all of this data, and we might want to see that regulated better. And we even have examples where, Alibaba and Tencent, Chinese lenders, are using very unusual data to decide whether to give loans. Again, cutting in these places, basically cutting out of the loop entirely the labor that used to be involved in evaluating those applications. And we are going to be increasingly thinking about what types of evaluations are proper in the workplace, right? These examples from this page have not been used in the workplace yet, but they foreshadow what could happen eventually. So for example, a report by Privacy International on scoring and evaluation noted that if lenders see political activity on someone's Twitter account in India, they'll consider repayment more difficult and not lend to that individual. One proposal I would put out there is that a person's political views should not be part of any workplace evaluative process, right? And I would put that into finance as well in many areas, but for talking about the workplace today, I think that's something that's really fundamental to freedom of political thought, is to be able to have a political life without worrying about that impinging on one's workplace life. Similarly, with respect to firms analyzing the way that you fill in a form and how you use a website and what kind of that device and what location, there's recent work by Sandra Wachter that describes how oppressive this can be and the need to really watch out for evaluative systems that are going to be looking at people's biometric data in that way. It's even more intense if you think about the way in which even something like the way someone moves their mouse on their computer could be used in a model to predict Parkinson's disease. So this is an example of something that we do every day, but we don't know the types of signals that it's sending. And it's probably too late to stop those signals from being sent. I mean, one could, put in some sort of program on your computer to fuzz your mouse movements as a privacy enhancing technology, but it's probably too late for the mass of people to do that. Really, we need regulation. Now, in terms of thinking about these tools of evaluation, one thing I would notice that a lot of this is based on statistical analysis of correlations, right? For example, with HireVue, or maybe not, I wouldn't say HireVue in particular, but with firms that are trying to correlate, say, the way someone acts or talks online with the actions of past workers, it may be that someone that, say, continually looks at the camera better correlates to those workers in the past that have been more successful, and that is put into the hiring algorithm. And I think the worry that I think is really prominent, should be prominent here, is that correlation does not equal causation, right? It could just be a random correlation, as we see from the example here, that the divorce rate in Maine per 1,000 people is perfectly correlated to the butter consumption, right, in the United States. That doesn't mean that divorces in Maine are driving butter consumption, or that butter consumption is driving divorces in Maine. It just means there's a correlation. And too much of this AI is based on these types of correlations that really have no grounding in a theory of how the activity actually contributes to one's performance. I would just note briefly that if we want to refine the digitization of judgment in these workplace contexts, there are many steps in the process of developing machine learning programs where we could intervene. We could intervene in terms of how the problem is defined. How do we define a good worker? How the data is collected? What limits do we put there? How the data is cleaned? How are outliers discovered and isolated? How are summary statistics reviews done, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things are part of Lerron Ohm's work, Playing with the Data, which describes how important it is for those in policy roles to realize each step in the machine learning process. I'll also note that many times, if there's a bias concern, those behind these programs say, well, if only we get more data, there'll be less bias. But critical social scientists like Virginia Eubanks and Kara Bridges really question that narrative. They ask us to think that, in fact, or they ask us to consider whether the demand for more data, rather than being an effort to find out the truth of the situation or to evaluate people in the best and fairest way possible, can just be a power play, demanding more and more information about people's lives. So 2 last slides. One, my penultimate point here is that it can often be wise to limit the digitization of judgment because of something called Campbell's Law. And what that states is the more any quantitative social indicator is used for social decision-making, the more subject it will be to corruption pressures, and the more apt it will be to distort and corrupt the social processes it is intended to monitor. And my worry when I think about those earlier examples of the digitization of judgment, as they run into the workplace or as they are adopted in different workplaces, is that they are creating incentives for gaming and creating incentives for excessive focus on certain ways of demonstrating one's performance that are ultimately going to be counterproductive, both for those served by employees and for employees themselves. And I think that this question of corruption pressures on all the forms of AI and the digitization of judgment that we see is a big one. If we think about, for example, people looking at doing interviews online, there will probably soon be a whole cottage industry of how to get the algorithm to like you more. And this is something that I think is not contributing to anyone's workplace performance. It's just trying to get past an arbitrary gatekeeper. And that I think is troubling. So my preliminary conclusion here is that there's a case both for limits and for refining the digitization of judgment. The case for limits is that there are often there are forms of surveillance that are too intensive and intrusive. So for example, if an employer wants 24/7 phone location monitoring from employees, if they want all phone data, that's going to be a real problem, and it's oppressive. And making it clear in the law that that's not allowed is important. We should also note that many employers are pushing now for anti-fraud exceptions to privacy law. They're saying, oh, well, I need to be monitoring where my employee is 24/7, just so I know that they're not committing fraud on me, right? And I would really watch out for that in the future, particularly in jurisdictions that have strong privacy law, because it seems like an easy exception to grant, but it's an exception that may swallow the rule. But we can't, I see no future where these types of tools are gotten rid of entirely, right? So as they continue to develop, we're going to need to have more objective performance assessment with them that includes possibilities for democratizing metrics. But that democratization will always entail some level of politics and some ways in which Campbell's and Goodhart's law will lead to pressures of the measures that it's influencing. So with that, I can close out of my slides, and I really look forward to the questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. This has been fascinating, and you have pointed out very, very new concepts, I think, that it's a brand thing. We know that worker surveillance is being more intrusive everywhere, not only in China. And we see it a lot in the EU as well, in the US. And you spoke about regulation, and I would like to know what would be your ideas about regulating artificial intelligence.
Absolutely. I think that one of so in my relatively new book, New Laws of Robotics from 2020, I have a chapter called Machines Judging Humans. And in that chapter, I'm particularly interested in the extent to which a machine should be able to judge a person and whether an explanation for the judgment is necessary. So the two forms of regulation that I would start with about this material would be, first, to always inform someone of the data being used to judge them. Second, to give that there has to be some level of explainability, like Article 22 of the GDPR guarantees a right of explanation. In the California Privacy Rights Act, there's a right to meaningful information about automated processing of data. That type of right to meaningful information is very important, giving people a sense of the weights of different aspects of the AI evaluative process. I would also say that in an ideal world, that employees would be working with employers in specifying what a metric is. Because I think often what ends up happening in workplaces is that you may have some employees that sort of figure out how to game the metric or how to do best at it. And they may focus all their attention on that it leaves other employees, sort of left in the lurch, having to try to make up for the things that aren't being measured, but still are necessary for the success of the workplace. And so I think that's another area where, there's an old saying in design justice, nothing about us without us. And I think that, to the extent that we could put the mantra of nothing about us without us with respect to workplace monitoring, that would be important. I'd also point out there's a really good article by Karen Levy and a couple of co-authors on nursing home monitoring in the US, because that's one where it's the value judgments are very difficult, because on the one hand, you have people who are extremely vulnerable, very vulnerable elders who cannot feed or dress themselves in many situations, or even use the toilet sometimes, who are utterly reliant on the home care aides. And after there were some examples of abuse and neglect, people started pushing for monitoring of at least the rooms of these elders, and sometimes monitoring the entire care home. And that seems like, well, these are the most vulnerable, let's protect them. But on the other hand, there has to be some concession to the need to make the workplace livable or bearable, right? No one can really bear being watched by a camera and videotaped 24/7, And so therefore, what Levy and her co-authors describe are all these different state laws that are compromises over the need for monitoring versus the need for a humane workplace. And that's where I think it's really going to be, and that's where the work of unions is so essential, because it's something where you need to have a democratic process of participation by those in the workplace to be able to say, this is acceptable, this is not acceptable, and to negotiate with the business. Because the other thing that's really pressuring a lot of these developments is that businesses are being told increasingly, the more data you collect, the more money you'll make, right? And so they have this sort of generalized sense that the more data equals more profit. And as the cost of storage goes down, that becomes even a higher pressure. And so that's got to be a countervailing force, saying, well, either give us co-governance of that data or limit it to make this a humane scenario.
Co-governance means kind of opening the black box in the
Absolutely,
company, right?
yes.
So if we want to open the black box, and as you said, acquire more information in order to know, and in order to be able to negotiate, and in order to be able to understand the explanations, what does it need to happen in the workplace in order to that be really meaningful for workers to do something?
Yeah, I mean, this is one where there's a really interesting set of existing rights and proposals that are out there. So existing rights under the GDPR, Articles 13, 14, and 15, everyone has a right to the data that a corporation holds about them, including workers, right? So workers have the right, and often in the US, there's sort of separate consumer and labor regimes. In Europe, you have this very direct right to know this data. And also, under Article 22, to know the logic of the information and the processing. But where it's going to get difficult is that you will have a lot of the third-party entities that run these programs saying, this is a proprietary trade secret protected method, and therefore you don't have access to it, or you can have only minimal access to how this data is being processed. And that's going to be a really important issue on the horizon. There's a case that came out recently involving Dutch drivers who sued Uber and Ola. And it's described there's a report, I think, called Managed by Bots that describes their struggle. And as I understand it, they've won their most recent appeal, and they've been able to demand a lot of data from Uber about how they're being evaluated. But I don't know all the filing there, but all the filings in that case. But my sense is that Uber said that there was some argument that they should not have to give up that data because it was a proprietary trade secret information that was their secret sauce, et cetera, et cetera. And the court wasn't accepting that. The court was saying, yes, there's a balance, but here we really have to strike this balance in a way that recognizes the importance of the worker interests here. And there's also, I think, Fairtube was an entity that helped creators on YouTube to demand their data, because increasingly we're seeing people forced to be in a gig economy, and that's something, and I know we don't usually think of YouTube and Google as gig economy workplaces, but when I think about what YouTubers are doing, putting up huge amounts of content, hoping they're not demonetized, et cetera, it's really important for them to be able to understand what are the triggers that could lead to their demonetization, where they can't make any money anymore. What are the terms on which they're being judged? How are they being ranked and rated, et cetera? All of those things are really critical, and I hope to see that be another aspect of the black box that's opened. And ultimately, as these black boxes get opened, there's going to be public pressure, and in a further future, there may well be demands that the people who are on the platform have some governance of how it is watching them and how it's judging them, and to stop the most egregious aspects of that.
Yes, Frank, and I think that indeed the GDPR offers a bunch of rights that trade unions and workers can make use of. But here I would like to pull out, bring in a question from the audience. What do you think about the EU's AI Act? Do you think that it addresses these concerns that you have been explaining with regards to the workplace?
I think that it's a very good first step, and I think that it's good. It's good to have. If I were to describe the act, I'd say that it's an effort first to divide forms of AI into different levels of risk. And my sense is that a lot of the things I've just been describing would be in the high risk category. If you're in the high risk category, then you have to, then the entities deploying those technologies, be it the vendors or the users in particular, have to get some level of certification that they are actually obeying the relevant laws, and that they're actually being used in a legitimate way. And so I think that is helpful. But I mean, the devil is in the details. The devil is in the details of like what the standardization bodies are going to demand. And my rough sense is that these standardization bodies are not entities that have a great deal of experience in human rights or labor rights. And so the key thing is going to be, I think, for unions sort of facing this issue, is going to be how to bring the concerns of their members to the standardization bodies, so that there are certain standards that have to be met. For example, say data access, data deletion, transparent forms of judgment. All of those, I think, are things that could be put into the relevant standards, but that right now it's very vague as to how far that's going to go.
Yeah, thank you very much. But maybe we have some surprises, like the recent surprise that the state of California has brought to us, as there is a new proposal of a bill, the Workers' Right Workplace Technology Accountability Act, freshly proposed by the Assembly member Ash Carla. Maybe you can explain to us what is this about, and what's your opinion about it, because it seems to go a bit further than the AI Act in regulating workers' rights, right, Frank?
Yeah, and let me actually bring the Office of Assemblyperson Kalra has released a PowerPoint that I could actually show some aspects of this act, because it's complicated legislation, and so it might be best to give a preview of it. So here's what this is a PDF. So the Workplace Technology and Accountability Act being proposed by Assembly member Kalra. So if you look at the problem, right, the problem as defined by this act, let me actually do a full screen of this, sorry. Oops. Oh yeah, we're okay. The problem as defined by this act is a problem of employers using electronic monitoring to watch their workers' every move, right? Oops. And this is a really big problem. And a lot of these sort of technologies are being adopted with virtually no oversight or guardrails, leaving the door wide open for abuses, right? And so essentially what this act would do is it would establish worker rights and employer responsibilities in many ways, right? First, to transparency requirements. Second, responsible use, and that includes the not monitoring workers off duty, not using unproven or high-risk technologies, not using algorithms to predict worker behaviors unrelated to their jobs. This is really interesting because I was recently reading a report, and actually, let me see if I can find the title of this report, because it's an excellent report, and I want to be sure to get the title on the. It's a case study by Annette Bernhardt, Lisa Kresge, and Reem Suleiman of the UC Berkeley Labor Center, called Data and Algorithms at Work. Okay, and in this report, they described an algorithm that was being used by employers to predict which employees would be pregnant in the next year or so, or several years. And they were saying, well, we just want to be able to assign them to duties that will allow for a break or something. But it really seems like that's something that is a troubling aspect of employer control. And I will say that there's a lot of this in the United States because I think of the strange intertwining of healthcare coverage and of a lot of dependencies of healthcare coverage and sort of health concerns by these employers. And so there's another aspect of responsible use that's proposed in this act. And then finally, accountability, right? That employers will conduct impact, under responsible use, the last point I think is most important, right? Electronic monitoring and algorithms won't be used to automate decisions like hiring, firing, discipline, and promotion. That I think is really critical, because I think that there is a demand among a lot of, and a fair demand, that there be some human responsible for these decisions, right? And I think that was one of the most troubling aspects of early versions, or even some current versions, I think, of Uber's deactivation algorithm. Right? The people could just be deactivated via an algorithm. And I think one of the first things that a New York Drivers Guild did was they demanded the right to be able to say dispute if a driver gave someone a 1-star rating that kicked them out of the system, or if that happened a few times, be able to dispute that and give the driver's side of the story. And so that sort of question of automation is a really critical one in this proposed California Act. And of course, accountability with respect to employers conducting impact assessments, consulting workers throughout the assessments, and the act being enforced by the labor agency, and workers having a private right of action. That last one I think is particularly important, that private right of action, because I think that there's often concerns that these agencies become overwhelmed, or they have just too much work to do, and to have the workers themselves be able to sue is really critical. So just, I guess, one last sort of point here is just in thinking about the different chapters. There are general provisions, there's a worker data chapter, an electronic monitoring chapter, particularly that first bullet point under chapter 3, employers only allowed to use electronic monitoring for specific purposes. Points about algorithms and giving prior notice before using algorithmic decision systems, documentation of productivity algorithms, further impact assessment and enforcement. Now, again, all this is proposed. So, and I'll stop the share now, but I'll say that all this is just proposed, and it may well be too much for California, even at this point. And of course, there's also the worry that, as we saw with the Uber-funded proposition on the sharing of the gig economy from a few years ago, even if the assembly passes it, there's always the worry that employers will have a referendum that will repeal it, and that is still being, still quite a bit of controversy over that in California with respect to the platform workers. But in any event, I think it is a hopeful sign that you have a bill this robust being promoted by Assemblymember Kalra, and I hope to see there be future versions of this in other states and in jurisdictions around the world.
Hopefully in the EU as well. And let's talk about the question from the audience here. In your opinion, is there a risk that AI-specific regulation hinders AI innovation more than it helps mitigate the risks associated with the use of the technology?
I have a couple of thoughts on that. And I think that, there's one thing that I think is, that we have to consider is, what kind of AI innovation do we want? A lot of times the AI innovation is spoken as if there's a big pool and you could have and water is AI innovation, and we just fill the pool, but if you regulated it all, that's like interfering with the tap. And I think a better way of thinking about it is that the laws and regulations are like a filter you put on the water that keeps, dirt and salmonella and, disease and other things, muck from the water from getting into the pool, right? So, I mean, I think that's, and yes, is the filter going to lead to perhaps a little bit less water getting in? To be sure, but it's better water. And you can do a lot more in a pool with water that's been purified than you can in one that is not. So in this case, I think that, making sure that innovation in AI in the workplace is something that's not going to be premised on 24/7 monitoring or black box algorithms or, opaque systems of automating hiring and firing, that's worth it, even if it does slow down the adoption of these technologies in the workplace. I'll also note that, it's part of I mean, from a very macro perspective, I am comfortable with laws that discourage innovation in the ranking and rating and sorting of human beings. That's another theme of my book, New Laws of Robotics. Like a lot of the people that are working on this AI stuff that is sort of ranking and rating human beings, I'd be very happy if their attention was turned to, say, climate change or medical AI or something that is about trying to control carbon emissions or cancers as opposed to controlling and monitoring human beings. And so therefore, I think that this innovation discourse and the sort of alleged trade-off is not really one that I buy into. I think that there's not just it's not just a question of sort of creating a larger pie that we all get a larger slice of. It's a question of the quality of the pie, the quality of the water in the pool, whatever your metaphor is. That's really the key here.
This is fascinating, Frank. And just linking to your response, I would like to ask the question from Stephen Tatum. And it says, which regulations could be introduced to foster an environment of open algorithms, in quotation marks, or at least an economy of algorithms that people can choose from?
That's a good question in terms of thinking about like what would be. I mean, one thing that I could just throw out there would be that it may well be that if unions have concerns about the types of algorithms that are being deployed by corporations, that they propose their own model algorithms of assessment, right? And that's a tough question, right? The question becomes, does one buy into the increasing algorithmatization of judgment, of evaluation of persons? Or does one say, look, we just want to limit it. We don't want to try to play that game or refine it. We want to limit it. The presumption of this question, or the premise of this question, I think, is that the algorithms are good and can be used by many people. And I think that, it's to the extent that, we want to see more open algorithms, probably the best way to get there is to reduce intellectual property protection for existing algorithms, right? So that you have less ability of an algorithm developer who's commercial and who's proprietary to sue someone for patent infringement or for trade secret infringement or even trademark infringement, whatever it might be. That may be the key is the sort of loosening in IP protections on those algorithms.
Exactly. Well, that's a very interesting proposal. I want also to ask a question from someone from Spain, Fernando Rocha, speaking about health and safety, specifically psychosocial risks and the impact of the algorithms in the psychology and psychosocial sphere of the employee. Do you think that this should be a specific area of legal regulation? For example, in Europe, we don't have a specific directive that regulates the risk of psychosocial risk at the workplace. But do you think it will be we need a case to do so? And of course, because psychosocial risks are very wide, what type of aspects should be considered if you have an opinion on that?
A terrific question. And let me think about 2 layers of psychosocial dimensions to these algorithms, even 3 layers, right? So a first layer that I'm going to bring up is in the realm of hiring. And this, has been called to my attention and the world's attention by a man named Roland Behm, B-E-H-M, whose son had mental illness and who was trying to get a job at an entry-level job as a bagger or cashier at different stores, and who was always failed thanks to a personality test. There was a personality test that would evaluate him. And basically the argument there was that this test was discriminating against people who had psychosocial disabilities, right, or who had at least some mental illness. And Beam has been working on this question for a long time. He recently was tweeting about how he believes that a lot of the automating hiring software does not comply with relevant guidelines and on anti-discrimination. And I think that's a real issue. A second example of a psychosocial dimension here would be for individuals at work, does constant surveillance and evaluation via algorithm erode their sense of autonomy? And I would say particularly, is it alienating? And the term alienation is a really important one. It's kind of gone out of vogue lately, but it connotes a sense of meaninglessness, powerlessness, and isolation. So are these algorithms creating these senses of meaninglessness, powerlessness, isolation? That's a real question, right? That's a really deep and difficult question that I think we have to address. And if we believe that that's what's happening, then they are eroding psychosocial well-being, and they need to be limited accordingly. The third dimension of this is something that has, so far, I think is mainly a US problem, although it might be a problem elsewhere. It's a problem of the workplace, the employer, at least via a proxy like a wellness program, wanting to assess the psychosocial well-being of the employees under the rubric of trying to make sure that they're that they're as well as possible, to be as productive as possible. And Gordon Hull and I wrote about this in an article on corporate wellness programs a few years ago, where our concern was that we really felt it was inappropriate for employers to be inquiring often about intimate dimensions of their employees' mental health lives. I remember when I was at University of Maryland, there was actually a survey that the wellness program gave us that asked us questions, about the health of our relationships, our marriage, whether we trusted our boss or not, all these sorts of things. And while it's supposed to be kept distinct from the employer itself, it still just seemed odd to be asked all these intimate questions in the workplace. So that I think but that I will note sets up a really interesting dichotomy, right? Because on the one hand, we could say, if we had a paternalistic view of the employer, we could say the employer has an obligation to ensure that the employees are feeling as good as possible, and therefore should be collecting mental health data regularly. But if we have a more autonomy-focused view that looks on the autonomy of the employer and sort of a privacy-focused view, the privacy-focused view would say, this is creepy, it's strange to have an employer be so interested in, my home life, my feelings, et cetera, and that there should be a strict division there. So I think that that's a great question. And, those three dimensions of the psychosocial are critical, and I'm sure will be cause for a lot of debates in the future.
Yeah, they are causing lots of debates indeed. And linking to this psychosocial dimension, I would like to also ask a question related to another very intimate dimension of the human being, which is the emotional dimension. Employers are not only measuring all sorts of data inputs, but they are also trying to measure our emotions as workers. Here, Ana Belén Muñoz Ruiz from Spain also asked a question, and she would like to know your opinion on the emotional control of employees and whether you think that there would be a need for a legal limit.
Absolutely. Terrific question. It's actually something I'm working on right now. I'm working on an article called 5 Critiques of Affective Computing. And this is how it's usually in the computer science community. They rather than calling something emotional computing, they tend to call it affective computing, based on the early work by Rosalind Picard and others at MIT on this topic. And I have a number of issues with this type of technology. First, the premise of it is that the computer and the AI behind the computer can both read and potentially write emotions, right? And to the human being that it's interacting with, right? And that the first aspect of this is already troubling to me, because there's a model of the human brain as like a chip on which the employer is going to be reading what's on the chip and writing onto the chip, to try and program the employee to do certain things or other things, or at least to act a certain way when confronted with certain stimuli, right? So that I think is problematic. I think that there's the issue that I think is really the key here is a pretty deep philosophical one about what we think emotion stands for and means in our lives, right? And I think in some of the literature on affective computing, the assumption is that emotion is something to be used behavioristically to sort of smooth out human interactions to enable maximum efficiency, right? Whereas I think of emotion as being something far more central and core to one's identity that is simultaneously a judgment and thought about the world, and that thought's coupling with feelings of whatever the whole range of feelings can be, to give oneself guidance about one's situation. And I think that there's a whole mode of authenticity. There's a way in which the emotions kind of, rather than being just one thing that you're using to interact with the world, like you use a fork or a knife or a tool or something, that rather they are expressions of one's inner being and one's inner self. And so to the extent that you have emotional, both efforts to recognize emotions, they get in trouble in my book because they're essentially, if we look at them deeply, what they're trying to do is they're not just trying to recognize emotions, but they're also simultaneously prescribing ways of looking and conducting oneself in order to produce the apprehension of emotion that will lead to rewards from the machine or from the employer, right? It's not about the employer. I think it's not really about the employer trying to figure out what the employees are feeling, et cetera. I think it's much more about trying to force a certain response. And I remember there was this one workplace where people had to smile at the biometric camera to get into a door. There were other workplaces where they're sort of looking, they're just trying to make sure that your tone of voice is right. And there would be, and this can happen on the consumer side too. There was a call center that would route people to certain customer service representatives based on how agitated their voice sounded, if they sounded really angry or if they sounded not so angry. All of these things I think are really troubling and at the very least need to be disclosed, but they also need to be, we need to think more deeply about them. And I think the most dangerous form of this technology is one that is meant to sort of create emotions in individuals, to write emotions to a given minds, because I think that's an area where it's one thing if that's being done at arm's length by two individuals that can walk away at any point and have no deep relation to one another. It's that, and fine, let people do whatever they want with respect to emotional community in those scenarios. But between workplace and worker, between employer and worker, et cetera, that's a relationship that is quite an important one. It's quite, there's a lot riding on it. There are often big power imbalances. And in those situations, it seems like something that is much more likely to be forced onto someone rather than freely accepted by them. And so in all those ways, I am suspect of affective computing and emotional computing.
Thank you for clarifying that. Actually, there are lots of things to do in this field of work, and I would like to ask now a little bit about the employers' side, the workers, when they are being asked to perform. Here, Kevin Rogers asks, what can you say to employees' psychological aspect of performing to metrics? It's what you said before. It's about hitting the benchmark, whatever that benchmark is. Or what do you have to say on employees that are pressed to perform to the expected metric, but the measurement of the metric is collective, and the metric expectations is 100% of even higher, and in that ceiling is viewed as a failure. So do you have some thoughts about that, Frank?
I do. I mean, I think it's really worrisome because I think that there's situations where there can be a lot of peer pressure in those scenarios, and the sense that, I don't want to let down the team, or I want to be sure that I have, and I think that that's, I think that, it brings us back to the old debates, and David Noble talks about these a lot in Forces of Production, of people on an assembly line and the types of battles among different workers, say, to ensure that some were not making others look bad, right? And I think and I think what's fascinating here is that, in David, in the world of, say, the beginning of the assembly line, there was a concern. There were people that would just be throwing themselves into the job in an unsustainable way, and in that way, forcing a speed up onto everybody else, right? Or at least setting up a benchmark that was really troubling. Now, of course, can it go in the opposite direction? Sure, there are certainly workplaces where you could go far in the opposite direction, and you have what's called feather bedding, where people are not doing them not very much at all because there's sort of a peer pressure to do very little. But I think what's worrisome about the AI here is its ability to break solidarity by simultaneously individualizing the metrics and generalizing them. So you both have individualized, like Amazon will know, with, say, different trackers that they might put on someone's hand or other things like that. They'll know essentially how many things person is pulling from the shelf, putting down, et cetera, and then can, say, report to a larger work team, whether you were above average, below average, things like that. And that, I think, is a potential eroder of solidarity in those scenarios. And I think that's tough. And I think the other thing that I think is really a good question to ask about these types of workplaces is, are they workplaces that are aiming to give someone a stable form of employment for a good number of years? Or are they places that are trying to basically grab people, work them extremely hard, use them up, and then throw them out, to some other job? And I'm not saying that Amazon does that generally, but I do think there's some evidence that shows that, they have a very high rate of workplace injury. In some places, there's a very high rate of turnover. So even though they have, a lot of ways in which they say they're characterizing themselves as trying to be a more humane employer, you still look at that and you have to wonder, what's exactly going on here, and what's the strategy involved here? That's, I think, is a deep question for the labor movement in general, is how suspect do we think these places are that have that type of model? I know in the US as well, there's an example of Teach for America bringing in students, right out of college to teach in very underprivileged schools and expecting a huge amount of work out of them. But is that a model? Is there a model that, it seems like, I don't think that's necessarily where we want to go as a society, where we encourage employers to set these backbreaking or incredibly fast-paced metrics, squeeze everything out of people that are already in the workplace, and then just shift them out and then get a whole new fresh bunch that they can also squeeze as hard as possible. I'm sorry for the diffuse response, but that's just a few thoughts that just come to mind in thinking about that problem. Yeah.
There is no diffuse response at all, Frank. Thank you so much. And I would like to know a little bit about your plans in the future. You have been recently very involved in US policy making, and probably between EU and US policy making. You have been appointed, if I'm correct, to the US EU Trade and Technology Council. Is that correct?
I have not heard of that appointment yet. So I know that there are entities that are definitely, it's a very important council, and I've talked to people that have worked on it, but I am not myself on it. But I'd be very happy to look into that. So yes, yeah.
But you have been advising U.S. policymakers.
Yes, U.S. side, yes.
Yes, and what in a nutshell, what would be your advice in order to draw or to drive AI legislations to the directions that you have been pointing out throughout this talk?
I think my biggest piece of advice would be for those who are making the policy, to consider whether they would accept the AI surveillance that's being used in their own lives. And if not, then to find regulation that will help make it more humane generally, right? One of the things, so to give an example here, in the US Federal Trade Commission during the Trump years, seemed very positive about Uber and platform work. They seemed to think that this was the wave of the future. This was great. It was all about flexibility. It was win-win-win, et cetera. And so I wrote an article, well, if you really believe that, and these are all government workers in the US who enjoy quite a bit of job security, many of whom stay in the same job for 10 to 20 to 30 years. And I wrote and I said, well, if you really think the platform economy is so good, you should create an Uber for your own positions. So every day you could bid, but then if someone bids lower, to get a lower rate of pay for your position, you have to give it up to them, right? And of course, they were angered by this, right? They did not want this at all. But the thing was, they were, and I said, well, if you don't want this, then why are you trying to push it onto all workers generally? Why do you think it's so good for a car service or other scenarios like that? And I think that sort of golden rule idea of, are you willing to accept the AI that you see, now judging someone's interview from 3 minutes of a video, or judging someone's performance as a teacher from, aggregated pictures of the students' faces. If you're not willing to accept a version of that in your own life, then consider how you can help either remove it from other people's lives, or at least make its burden less of a burden on those other person's lives.
Thank you very much, Frank. I think that with that, we can close our fantastic webinar with you. Everything that you have said has been resonating among our audience. They are asking for the references that you just mentioned of the different scholars. Maybe we can gather them and send them together with the presentation. And we have learned a lot about metrics, the extension of the power of the metrics, and of course, the digitization of the judgment, and the workers' ability to negotiate about AI and about their data. We will see maybe in the future, in a further talk with you, how the bill in the US and in California and the forthcoming AI Act will turn. And with that, this brings us to the end of our today's episode. Thank you. A hard thanks to you, Frank Pasquale, our guest, for being with us, and to you all, our audience. And if you don't have any other final thoughts, Frank, we hope that you have found today's episodes interesting. Thank you. Thank you for turning into our AI Talks at ETUI, and see you next time.
You're welcome, and thank you. Okay, bye.
Goodbye, everyone.